Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are continuing our series talking about Thieves Guilds. We're currently talking about Masters in your Thieves Guild, and today we're going to be talking about the Master Enforcer. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Today we are talking about the Master Enforcer within the Thieves Guild. We've been going through this Thieves Guild series for several weeks now, and we've kind of talked about the leadership and the layout and the structure of your guild, and now we are going through a series of looking at the different masters that are in charge of different elements and jobs within your Thieves Guild. Last week we talked about the Assassins, and today we're going to be talking about the Master Enforcer. John, can you give us some idea of who the Master Enforcer is and why it's necessary to have this individual in the Thieves Guild?
Yeah, so Master Enforcer is a lot of like what it sounds like. And most of the masters we're going to talk about, they kind of have like this internal role that goes into what they're doing in the Thieves Guild, and it also goes into the jobs that they manage for the guild as a whole. So the Master Enforcer, in terms of his role within the guild, is that he's the one who keeps the guild members in line. So he's in charge of discipline. He's basically the muscle of the masters, just in terms of making sure that other guild members are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So there's kind of this fine line. We're going to talk about the Taskmaster later, who works closely with the Master Enforcer, but the Master Enforcer is the one who, if push comes to shove, he's the one who comes in and busts heads to make sure that the guild members are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and he is the one who uses violence to enforce that within the guild.
Yeah, I always see him as being this guy that's like in charge of the discipline, but he also understands a certain element of restraint in that discipline.
Right.
He doesn't ever go to the full edge of, killing somebody, but he may maim you or injure you or leave you a scar that will be remembered in terms of his authority and his power, and that you are going to listen and bend to his will. And you don't only see that in his interaction with maybe the guild members, but also in terms of the jobs that he puts out there, that there's always like this level of
controlled violence.
Again. Yeah, control. Yeah, that's a great word. It is this full level of control in what he's doing. He knows the boundaries in which he can play in, and he doesn't mind tiptoeing along the line. Yeah,
he doesn't deal with the mundane in and out. Are you doing your job? Are you going to work? That type of thing. He's the one who comes in if somebody like has towed over the line at a certain point too. He works closely with the Guildmaster because the limitations of what he is permitted to do in terms of violence is always stipulated from the higher ups. And generally speaking, like you said, he'll inflict wounds or violence potentially on guild members, depending on exactly what that looks like. But he also doesn't want to prevent a member from being able to work or hurt them so bad that they're not able to get back on the job relatively quickly, because it's important that the members are continuing to produce income for the guild as a whole.
Sorry, I just got this image of Ben Stiller and his Tropic Thunder thing when they beat up on Jack Black's balls. And like, he doesn't need his balls for tour. It's like, you know that level that you can go to. So what type of jobs, sorry to digress, what type of jobs do we look at from the Master Enforcer?
Okay, so
providing for players.
There are three jobs that generally I associate with the Master Enforcer. That's Extortion, Robbery, and Kidnapping. And like I said, all three of those jobs have one thing in common, and that is controlled violence. It is about taking actions or threatening to take actions in order to gain income. And that's the biggest thing. Now, there always is the possibility of that going farther than needed, or it's always the possibility of executing on something. So, for instance, a kidnapping job. If there's a threat of violence that you are going to do something bad to the person you've kidnapped and you don't fulfill that, then it's not a very effective. You're not effective at kidnapping, because the authorities will just go, yeah, he does this once a week. He never kills anyone. No big deal. Just let him ride it out and that person will be free. So there has to be that execution on the far end of the job, which works in the same way for Extortion. If there's a threat of violence and the person can't pay and the violence never comes through, then it doesn't really do any good, does it? But at the same time, if you kill the person you're trying to extort, you're not gonna get more money out of them ever. So there's also that fine line.
I was going to say that the threats of violence typically are not to kill somebody.
Right.
That's not the threat that's going to be presented because the enforcer wants to make sure he can follow through with the threat, and it plays within that boundary limit of what it is that he can do. So maybe I'm going to break your legs, or I'm going to cut off a finger, or I'm going to pull out your teeth. It's going to be something that is terrifying and traumatizing that he can actually fulfill and enact, while still leaving a door open to get whatever it is that he wants out of the individual that he's threatening with violence. So those threats are always things that he can actually enforce and utilize. So it's not going to be, you're going to do this, or I'm going to kill you. Because then he would never get what he wanted.
Right, which in the kidnapping example, like, that's the extreme case. Like, eventually if the person doesn't pay, but generally speaking, there's that progression, right? It's like, you need to send me money, by in the next day, otherwise you're going to get a finger in the mail. So there's going to be that progression, but eventually he has to be able to execute on the threat if it doesn't come into play. So that's why, generally speaking, all of these jobs take a very fine touch just in terms of picking the right victims. Because if you pick somebody who is either too stubborn and you're going to have to kill them in order to be able to make a point, you're not getting money out of it. It doesn't benefit the guild to pick someone who's too stubborn. So you have to find the right kind of person who's malleable enough that they're willing to fall for the ruse or be afraid of threats of violence or something else like that, because it doesn't do any good otherwise. But you also have to find somebody who's got enough money that they're willing to pay. Because if you're picking someone who's too poor and you're kidnapping their child, it's like they don't have a choice. They don't have the money to give you what it is that you're asking. So that requires the use of either the spy master or members of the guild in order to take on exploration social quests to go find likely victims for the types of jobs that he wants to use.
So I think, and the reason in sharing this is one, that if your players are going to be in a Thieves Guild and interacting with the Enforcer, is also knowing there's probably going to be other pieces that are playing a part in determining what jobs he's going to be giving those players to do. Right. And you want to also make sure that you're including, as we talked about in our first video, the different pillars of play in each one of those jobs. So that it's not just a, go and threaten this guy and come back, or go and get my money from this guy with these threats and come back. There should be several steps that have to be taken in order for players to fulfill any job that you are giving them. Extortion, I think, is a complicated one, and probably one that we don't think about a lot. It is very much on that level of, if you don't do this thing, then violence can follow through. But it could also be potentially people paying in money, thinking that they're being protected from violence that they're not necessarily aware of. I think about Tulsa King that came out with Still Alone recently, where he essentially just walks into a cannabis shop and says, you're going to pay me 10% of whatever it is that you're making, and I'm going to protect you from the government. And the guy's like, but I'm not threatened by the government. He goes, but you could be, and that's why you're going to pay me. Right. And so he just goes in there and collects the money to protect him from an entity, and saying that they could hurt them or be more dangerous than they themselves being there to take that money. Yeah,
and we're going to talk about this later on, but this is different from blackmail, and we'll explain that a little bit more when we get into the Spy Master video where we talk about blackmail specifically. So extortion is definitely, it's the threat of violence, it's the threat of, it's that protection money, and I could see this job as being set up fairly early on for low-level characters, or low-level members of the Thieves Guild, who are basically going around and identifying people. So they would go in and use either social quests or exploration quests or a combination of those in order to identify targets throughout the city, throughout the region. And then they come back to their Master Enforcer and say, these are the ones that we want to potentially target. And then he will give the green light to go in there and try and extort them for money. And once that extortion process has begun and the appropriate intimidations have been made, it's just a matter of collecting and going in there, once a week or something like that and saying, all right, it's time to pay. But you can make those more interesting by, adding in, various resistances. Maybe the shop owner is trying to hire a thug or something else like that in order to try and protect his shop. He hires a party of adventurers to try and stop himself from being extorted. So you can have a lot of fun with this where you include other aspects of gameplay when it comes to an extortion style job or quest. But it does work as this passive form of income for the guild that is very important to its prosperity.
And I think we talked a little bit last week, too, just about the different moral dilemmas you may put your players through.
Mm-hmm.
And extortion comes down to that as well, I think, especially if they're coming to enforce violence onto somebody who is not paid up. And how far are the players willing to go in that? I don't know how dark you want to get in those scenarios, but it might also be an interesting area of play.
Yeah, and I think that the thing with this is that some of that moral stuff can come from the person they're attempting to extort. So, like emotional pleas to stop violence, that type of thing. But ultimately, what it comes down to is this is another one of those avenues where the players really have to show restraint, just in terms of if it comes to blows or if it comes to violence, it has to be maintained as non-lethal, because when it becomes lethal, you've crossed the threshold for law enforcement to suddenly be more concerned because there's a shop owner dead or whoever it is that you're extorting. And it also stops that flow of income for the guild. So it's better to show restraint than not to show restraint. And that is an aspect that I think is very important to capture. And I think many players may make the mistake of early on in their adventuring career.
Yeah, that's very true. And knowing that there's going to be consequences that come after that. I think that's going to be very important, that as a GM, you know those consequences are when they do go that extra step.
Right.
And we all have that guy at the table that always takes the extra step, and the rest of the players are mad at it and be like, why'd you kill that guy?
Yes.
All right. So robbery is the other type of job that is presented here. And it's very important to understand that robbery always has a people element involved within it. We're going to be talking about burglary and how it differs in another video, but robbery specifically is going to involve an individual that is held at some point, whether that's, tied up or held at sword point or something along those lines, and having items taken from them.
Held at wand point.
Or at wand point.
Yeah, we don't have guns, but we have a wand of magic missile.
But knowing that is going to be involved, and the thing that I like about robberies is that
the things I
like about robberies is that it causes the characters to have to tactically think how to fulfill that without being caught.
Right?
How are you going to lure your target down an alleyway or into a private place or into some area where you're not going to have passerbys notice what's going on or have them alert authorities?
Yeah, it's kind of like the classic thing that you see in, 1980s and 1990s movies or in horror movies where somebody goes down, like they go down this dark alley for whatever reason, and they get cornered by people, which I think in the movies a lot of times this seems like real straightforward and real easy, but I think that this could be an interesting planning process to make this somewhat fun, where you have your PCs be the thugs, and they're trying to corral somebody into a location specifically to be able to rob them and take their personal belongings, which, like I said, sounds easy enough, but not everybody is an idiot. And so if they leave a gap in this where it's like that person is walking down the road and they're like, oh, I don't want to go down this dark alleyway, there are people coming in front of me, and they try and go a different direction, have the PCs planned for that to try and stop them and try and force them into the direction they want to go to so that they can adequately rob them.
Yeah. And now that you mentioned 80s and 90s movies, I'm like, every movie has somebody getting robbed in an alleyway.
Yes. It's always some person who happens to be walking, and it's like they hear footsteps behind them, and instead of continuing down the well-lit street, they're like, I know, I'll turn down this dark alley. And they turn down an dark alley and get robbed or killed or whatever. And
they always get spooked and run down the dark alley.
Yes.
That's Howard the Duck. Nobody's gonna know that reference, but
yes, but that's what the players are trying to achieve. I just think that it's fun from the DM's perspective to try and thwart that. Play the person like a person who was not a TV victim in the 80s and 90s, and I think you'll be all right. This is the same thing for that threshold of violence. There should be a threat of violence. There might be minor non-lethal violence. Murder is not the goal in this scenario, because if you're going around murdering people and then robbing or taking their belongings, that is something where law enforcement is going to get more actively involved. It's not good for the guild. It's not good for the PCs, and they're going to get in trouble with the guild for taking those types of excessive actions.
Yeah, I appreciate you adding that. I was just going to put in there, this doesn't mean that robbery doesn't exist in establishments either.
Right.
They may still go in and rob, a local store or shop
Right.
that's in the area, but a person is involved, and there's threats of violence that are oftentimes included in that, and they should only be threats of violence that are going to be followed through with. And murder should not be the final outcome, because that raises more red flags for the guild than they want.
Right. So the last one on this list is kidnapping, and kidnapping falls very much into the same line as extortion and robbery. There should be a process of locating a victim, researching that victim through exploration and social quests, attempting to take that person, communicating with whoever you want to pay up, and then returning that person back to them in order to achieve some kind of income. So there is that process. It is a multi-step quest. It is not something that should just be snatching some random person off of the street and then trying to get money from somebody. There should always be a plan involved in this.
Mm-hmm. I don't know that I have anything else to add to kidnapping except for it doesn't have to be kids. Like, there's other options.
Yes, I would say most of the time you probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah, you shouldn't do that in your gameplay.
No, not really. We're talking about a lot of crimes and things on this channel recently, and just want to make it clear, we're not advocating these things. This is all a fantasy game. Anyway, so threshold of violence is still there. So we talked about this a little bit. We talked about this with all of them. Murder is not the goal for this. The goal is to return the person back to wherever they came from and then get something in return for doing so. It's taking something that somebody wants. It's taking someone that someone else wants or loves and then getting money for them in their safe return. There should be possible violence that occurs. It should be non-lethal. But this is also one of those things where the Master Enforcer may, in some ways pull the trigger because he's like, we have to make an example. These are very rare. It shouldn't happen very often. And this is definitely one of those moral quandaries that could come up for a gaming group where they have kidnapped somebody, the person is unwilling to pay, and then the PCs are responsible for either inflicting violence on the person or eventually murdering that person at the command of the Master Enforcer. And that creates excellent roleplay opportunities within the game for that style of play, if that's something you're interested in doing.
My only other thought on this, and this is kind of off the cuff, that isn't specific to Thieves Guild, but one of the things that I like about quest lines like this is that if you happen to have a group of players that are murder hobos and they just happen to kill everybody, and that's kind of the way they're going, setting up quest lines like this kind of puts a stall on that and enforces real consequences on the party to kind of stop that course of gameplay and bring it back into reality. And so I think that that's interesting to look at and how you can develop games, but that's probably a whole nother series that we got to do.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing earlier. If you have a particular, if you have a group that wants to play an evil campaign, and they're seeing it as this kind of murder hobo style scenario where it's just chaotic stupid and they do whatever they want, an actual organized Thieves Guild is, I think, a good way of having controlled violence within the game. There are consequences. They're not going to get paid. They're going to get in trouble, potentially even get kicked out of the guild if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're allowed to play the evil playthrough, but if they're not abiding by the rules, they're going to be in trouble for the things that they're doing. And I think it's a good way to basically have your cake and eat it too. Mm-hmm.
So let's throw that disclaimer out there one more time after that. We're not advocating for any of these crimes. That's going to have to be the new beginning of all of our videos instead of at the end. We're not advocating for it. This is all fantasy. It's all for gameplay. Right.
Which hopefully nobody's gotten this far in the video and thinks that. All right, so for this, that's all we have for the Master Enforcer for this video and the jobs that the Master Enforcer oversees. Our next one is going to have to do with the Master Fencer, which is the next one in our list, and we're going to go through. I think we've got more than another half a dozen or something after that when it comes to various masters and the jobs that they can control. But continue watching, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you can be updated when we're going through the rest of these guild masters and the various jobs that they oversee so that you can get ideas for running a guild-based campaign.
Judge and Brew.